Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a really major economic story of the last decade or so, the U.S.-China tariff war.
Yeah, definitely a big one. And it wasn't just about, numbers on a spreadsheet. The effects were felt everywhere.
Absolutely. Global markets, international relations, even down to like the price of stuff we buy.
hmm And a tariff war, just basically it's countries hitting each other with taxes on imports,
Yeah,
retaliation, trying to force changes.
right. But this one, I mean, we're talking the world's two biggest economies going head to head. That's huge.
It is. The scale was just unprecedented in recent times.
And it felt like it went beyond just trade, didn't it? It was also about, well, power,
Oh,
technology.
for sure. Global influence,
Yeah.
who's leading in tech, intellectual property disputes.
Yeah. And fundamentally, who gets to kind of set the rules for the global economy going forward?
That's a really important layer to keep in mind as we unpack this. It wasn't just about tariffs.
Exactly. That broader context, the geopolitical rivalry, that's sort of the engine behind a lot of this. Okay, so let's rewind. Where did this specific conflict really ignite? It kicked off around 2018 under the Trump administration, right?
That's right. The administration at the time had a list of complaints against China, things that had been, simmering for a while.
Like what specifically? What were the main accusations?
Well, the big ones were claims of unfair trade practices, theft of American intellectual property, that was a major focus, and also manipulating their currency to get an edge.
And the trade deficit, that huge gap in imports versus exports.
Yep, that too. The large, persistent trade surplus China had with the U.S. was definitely a key point of friction.
So what was the first actual move? What did the U.S. do?
The first concrete actions came in March 2018. Tariffs on steel and aluminum imports.
Citing national security, I remember that.
Right. Then, not long after, came a much bigger wave. Tariffs on about $50 billion worth of Chinese goods.
And those weren't random, were they? They targeted specific areas.
No, they were quite targeted, aimed squarely at industries that were part of China's Made in China 2025 strategy.
Ah, okay. That's their big plan to become a leader in high-tech stuff, right? Like AI, robotics.
Exactly. Electric vehicles, aerospace, biotech, the whole range. So the U.S. saw this as, well, a direct challenge to its own tech leadership. The tariffs were partly aimed at slowing that down.
And China's response? Did they just absorb it?
Not a chance. They retaliated almost immediately, slapped their own tariffs on American goods,
What kind of goods?
things like soybeans, which hit American farmers hard, and automobiles,
Yeah.
strategically chosen, to maximize the impact back in the U.S.
Right. Politically sensitive sectors. I remember reading how devastating that was for like soybean farmers who relied heavily on China.
Absolutely. It wasn't just lost income. It really disrupted entire communities and business models, showed the risks of depending too much on one market.
Yeah. And it makes you think of that Donald Trump quote from around then. Trade wars are good and easy to win.
Right. That statement certainly projected confidence early on.
But the reality turned out
Yeah.
differently.
Well, let's just say it proved to be a lot more complicated and drawn out than perhaps that quote suggested.
To say the least. Because it didn't end there. It just escalated, right? Became this massive back and forth.
It really did. By, say, mid-2019, the scale was enormous. The U.S. had tariffs on over $360 billion of Chinese imports.
Wow. And China.
China had retaliated with tariffs on roughly $110 billion of U.S. goods. Just huge numbers.
Can you walk us through some of the key escalation points? When did things really heat up?
Sure. A big moment was May 2019. The U.S. hiked tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods from 10% up to 25%.
Ouch, that's a big jump.
Yeah, that significantly raised the cost.
Right.
Then in August 2019, China hit back again. New tariffs on key U.S. exports, soybeans again, crude oil, cars.
Still targeting those sensitive areas.
Precisely. And then it broadened out even further, didn't it? It wasn't just industrial inputs anymore.
That's right. September 2019, both sides rolled out more tariffs, and this time they started hitting consumer goods much more directly.
Yep. Things like clothes, shoes, toys, electronics, stuff people buy every day.
So that's when, the average person maybe started noticing it more, like prices going up slightly on certain things.
Exactly. If you were buying a new phone or a laptop or even clothes around that time, chances are the tariffs played some part in the price you paid. It wasn't just an abstract economic policy anymore.
So real consequences felt by consumers, by farmers.
Oh, definitely. Farmers, especially the soybean guys, were squeezed hard. U.S. companies exporting to China found their goods suddenly more expensive over there.
And the markets. All this back and forth must have caused jitters.
Yeah, global financial markets definitely wobbled. The uncertainty was bad for business confidence all around. It's kind of amazing how quickly it spiraled.
It sounds like a lot of economic pain all around.
Yeah.
So who actually felt it the most? Were there clear losers? And I guess, were there any winners in all this?
Well, if you look at the losers, it's a pretty long list. American farmers, as we've said, took a big hit,
Mm.
especially with soybeans. American consumers definitely faced higher prices on lots of imported goods, electronics, clothes, furniture.
And manufacturers here.
Yeah, many U.S. manufacturers saw their costs go up because they were importing parts or materials from China that now had tariffs on them.
And China itself. They weren't immune, surely.
Not at all.
No.
China saw its factory output slow down, foreign investment got a bit more hesitant, and it definitely put some downward pressure on their overall economic growth rate.
Okay, so lots of negative impacts. What about the other side? Any beneficiaries? Anyone gain from this?
Well, you could argue there were some winners, maybe in a relative sense. Companies in other countries, like Vietnam or Mexico, saw a bit of a boost
Oh, so.
because businesses started looking for alternative places to source goods from to get around the U.S. tariffs on China. So some production shifted.
Diversification. Okay, anyone else?
The U.S. government technically saw increased revenue because they were collecting all those tariff payments.
Ah, right. The money had to go somewhere.
And perhaps cynically, you could say politicians on both sides maybe benefited.
How do you mean?
Well, they could use the whole standing tough on trade narrative to rally support at home. It played into that rising economic nationalism trend we've seen.
That's an interesting point. But it sounds like fundamentally the cost of the U.S. tariffs was mostly paid by U.S. businesses and consumers.
That's generally the consensus among economists, yes. While the goal might be to pressure the other country, the way tariffs work often means the importing country ends up bearing most of the direct cost through higher prices.
So after all that escalation, things seemed to cool down slightly with the Phase 1 deal in January 2020. What was that about?
Right, the Phase 1 agreement, it was presented as a kind of truce, a step back from the brink.
What did China commit to?
The main things were China promised to buy a lot more U.S. stuff, an extra $200 billion worth over 2 years across agriculture, manufacturing, energy services.
A huge amount.
A very ambitious target, yeah. They also committed to strengthening protections for intellectual property and, importantly, to avoid manipulating their currency.
That currency manipulation point keeps coming up. The idea was they kept the yuan artificially low.
That was the accusation, yes. Making their exports cheaper and imports pricier, helping their trade balance, so they pledged not to do that.
And what did the U.S. give in return for these promises?
The U.S. agreed to cut some tariffs in half, specifically some of those imposed in September 2019. But, and this is crucial, most of the tariffs stayed in place.
Ah, okay. So not a full rollback, more like dialing it back just a bit.
Exactly. It was more of a pause, maybe, than a resolution.
And then, literally weeks later, COVID-19 hit the world.
Right. Talk about throwing a wrench in the works. The pandemic completely upended global trade and supply chains, making everything far more complicated.
And did China even meet those huge purchase targets from the deal?
The general consensus among analysts is no, they fell significantly short of those $200 billion commitments. The pandemic obviously played a role, but many doubt they would have hit them anyway.
So Phase 1 kind of fizzled out.
It didn't really fundamentally change the trajectory. It felt more like a temporary ceasefire in a larger conflict.
Okay, so looking back now with some distance, what do economists and trade experts generally say about the whole tariff war? Did it, achieve what it set out to do?
The prevailing view, I'd say, is largely no. While it caused a lot of economic disruption, it didn't really fix those core issues the U.S. raised, like the alleged forced technology transfers or China's state subsidies for its companies.
So the underlying problems weren't resolved.
Mostly not, no. What it did do was really throw the deep economic rivalry between the U.S. and China into sharp relief.
And it pushed them further apart, this idea of decoupling.
Yes, absolutely. It's widely seen as having sped up that trend, both countries actively trying to become less reliant on each other, especially in critical sectors.
You mentioned talking to an analyst who had a good quote summing that up.
Yeah, they put it something like, the trade war marked a turning point. We're now entering an era of strategic competition, not just economically, but technologically and geopolitically.
Strategic competition. So decoupling is part of that. Businesses, governments trying to untangle those supply chains that got so interconnected.
Exactly. It's about reducing vulnerabilities, building resilience, and competing more directly in areas deemed critical for the future. The tariff war really highlighted those dependencies.
That definitely feels like where we are now. So fast forward to today, 2025. What's the situation? Are the tariffs gone?
Nope. Many, if not most of those tariffs are actually still in place.
Really? Even under the Biden administration?
Interestingly, yes. While the rhetoric might be different, the Biden administration has largely kept the Trump-era tariffs on China. The overall policy stance towards China remains quite tough on trade.
And the supply chain shifts, are those continuing?
Oh yeah, that's ongoing. Companies are definitely still working hard to diversify, moving some production out of China, trying not to have all their eggs in one basket. The China plus one strategy, you hear that a lot.
And the tensions have spread beyond just tariffs,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. Now, the focus is very much on things like semiconductors, the chip wars, artificial intelligence, data security, investments. It's broadened into a much wider national security and tech competition.
So looking back, the tariff war itself,
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't the main event, but more like the opening act.
That's a really good way to put it. It seems like it was just the start of a much longer, more complex period of strategic rivalry between the two powers.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways? What should we remember from this whole episode?
Well, a few big things stand out. First, it was a stark reminder of just how interconnected the global economy is. Decisions made in Washington or Beijing ripple outwards fast, often in unexpected ways.
Yeah, you can't really contain the effects.
Exactly. Second, it really underlined how economic power is now a major tool in geopolitics, right alongside military strength. Trade policy is foreign policy these days. And finally, maybe it showed the limitations of using tariffs as the main tool to fix complex trade issues. They caused a lot of disruption, but didn't necessarily solve the root problems.
Right. It seems the costs were high and the strategic gains questionable, perhaps.
That's certainly a strong argument, yeah.
And it leaves us with a pretty big question hanging in the air, doesn't it?
Which is?
Can these two giant economies, the U.S. and China, actually compete so intensely across so many areas without it leading to, even greater global division, instability, maybe even conflict?
That is the question, isn't it? How to manage this competition responsibly.
Yeah.
It's something that will shape, well, pretty much everything for the foreseeable future. Definitely food for thought.
Indeed. Something to keep pondering long after this deep dive.